As you know, the best and most honest conversations happen down the pub after a few drinks and can sometimes lead to missions that can define the next chapter of your life. I had one of those conversations with an owner and a friend of the company that I work for, where I explained how complex things were getting in the product and how I just didn't agree with the fundamentals of the current solution. That was obviously not what he wanted to hear after a sizable investment. However, I assured him that I had a vision for a reimagined product that would deliver on the original goals. After a few more sessions convincing a wider set of stakeholders, this led to a very interesting 2 or so year journey, which I'm going to share with you today. Hi, I'm Simon Callan. I'm an architect, engineer, and general tinkerer, leading the aspects of product over at Icon Solutions. During the next 30 minutes, I'm going to take you through our journey to overcome the challenges we had by applying a whole host of techniques and approaches such as domain-driven design, event sourcing, CQRS, microservices, reactive, to recreate the Icon payments framework. I'll do my best to try and leave a few minutes at the end for Q&A, but let's just see how we get on. For those familiar with accents, you'll know that I hail from the north of England, not too far from Manchester. I'll do my utmost best to be understandable. However, there is a chance you may have to wait for the replay and subtitles. I can see we've got a fantastic and friendly looking crowd here today, which is very flattering indeed. And I'm sure you just enjoyed an excellent keynote. This is probably going to be the least sexy deck you will witness at this conference, but I'll do my best to make it as interesting as possible. In true conference fashion, let's do a quick show of hands. So any architects in the house? Yeah, great. Engineers? Yeah, okay, that's good. Any payments people? Payments people, great. Anyone from our competitors? Come on, don't be shy, I know you're in there. Cool, okay, well it appears that I'm in great company. So, let's get into this. The payments ecosystem has been through a significant decade of change, and it's continuing to evolve through a mix of fintech innovation and regulation-driven change. Everything's shifting towards real-time with new ways to initiate a payment and new networks to clear and settle. Our sales team in client meetings sometimes say the phrase, a tsunami of payments, to emphasize the growth in electronic payments. So, there are many industry drivers which I'm sure you'll be able to relate to that are forcing banks to deliver change programs in order to respond to the changing landscape. API enablement and the disintermediation of the payments value chain means that there are many more players that operate and provide payment services. Open banking was probably the first catalyst. However, that's been considerably challenging to the banks who are mostly still dealing with a largely heritage landscape. As cash continues to decline and it gets easier and easier to make payments, new peaks are being reached each year and the banking infrastructure is being pushed to its limits. The tsunami of payments that I mentioned will only increase when you factor in machine-to-machine payments as well as micro-payments for things like royalties and gratuities. We live in a time of SaaS services and subscriptions, both in retail and in the B2B space, and that's only going to increase as more and more services come online and offerings are taken up. Standardization on ISO 222 being the universal standard for payments messaging is again a huge undertaking for the banks and something that has also forced modernization programs to begin in earnest. Each bank is at a different stage of its modernization journey. Most of the money is still being spent on run the bank, keeping the lights on, and little capacity is left for change the bank to make them more simple. This isn't, service availability is paramount, and you see what happens when things go bad. News organizations jump on the story and it damages the bank's reputation. With all of these headwinds and inherited challenges laid out, it's important to understand the key requirements as banks see them. It's not about volume, it's about value. Each payment must be processed efficiently and cheaply as possible. Nobody wants to wait 3 days or even a single day for a credit to hit their bank account. The younger generation has been spoilt to some degree and has only ever known instant and on-demand now. And this is where the volumes are going to be heading to more and more, and the banks need to make sure that they can fulfill those workloads. Services must be commoditized and the data must be exploited in order to engage customers in different ways and drive new sources of revenue. So with that backdrop, now let's look at the characteristics of the payments domain and the cross-functional requirements that exist. Elastic scalability is kind of a given nowadays for any production service. Cloud and containerization has made it a lot easier to achieve, and you've seen on the last slide about the growing volumes. Within the payments world, there are mixed workloads, so you get different payment types coming through, and you've got to make sure that the instant work isn't kind of stopped by the bulk work. And given that payments is concerned with money, no one likes to lose money, so it's got to operate with a very high degree of integrity. The payments domain is also highly integrated. There are lots of responses that are required from bank systems and also the interbank networks in order to process each request. I sometimes say that payments is a very elaborate way to integrate two ledgers. Payment services have got to be highly available, they've got to be resilient, they've got to be fault tolerant to failure, and also self-heal as standard. The final points are somewhat different for each client. They have their own standards and ways of operating their services. Security is a given, although we do find some differences in the approaches, but things like encryption in motion, encryption at rest are kind of the base standard that you would expect. I specifically point out quarterly releases to show that whilst the DevOps movement has been successful in modernizing practices with CI and CD, it hasn't quite become commonplace in the payments world just yet. Certainly tool chains and good practices are there, but it's still a big thing to do a release and requires a coordination of effort of many different teams. And final point is really on bespoke processing. So whilst payment journeys are roughly the same and the bank systems are roughly the same, each bank, to coin the Neil Ford term, is a snowflake. And they all do things slightly differently with different protocols and different messages and different standards. So that's quite a list. There's probably another 9 that I could put on there. But in the interest of time, now let's take a look at how the challenges that we face with the V1 of our products and how we reframe them into a set of product goals to reimagine our framework. So, our old friend, complexity. As you know, the compound effect of suboptimal decisions leads to a whole world of pain, and that technical debt has got to be paid down at some point. We struggled to explain how the V1 of our solution worked to new joiners and also found it difficult to make design decisions. To understand one thing, you had to understand everything, and the core logic was needlessly scattered around and complicated. It was inefficient. It was inefficient both in terms of adding new functionality and also led to a duplication of effort as we went to the next payment scheme and the next payment scheme and the next customer. Countless months were spent writing mappers to transform an old version of an ISO message into a newer version. And that's not the sort of thing you want to do with a set of highly skilled creative engineers. The solution was robust, but not really robust enough, and still required manual intervention for some esoteric situations. Brittleness tends to surface early in the build test cycle, And certainly when you have multiple teams working on a solution and on the same code base, a change to the core can kind of break everyone downstream, especially when it's not been well architected and you're depending on concrete objects and not interfaces, and you've not been following good practices. The last point before that's bounced in, nice. The last point here before I finally get into what we actually did about all of this is around the relatability of the solution. When you're explaining things, it's much easier to get your points over when you're talking about concepts and approaches that people are already familiar with. I remember being asked a simple question, so what is your architecture? Well, it's, and then I'd just grab a pen and jump to a whiteboard because it's a lot easier to explain it visually. Okay, another quick show of hands. How many of you have had to face and address some of these issues in the work that you do? Okay, yeah, that's quite a lot. How many of you are still kicking the can a little bit further down the road? Okay, one honest person over here, that's nice to see. Cool, okay, so what did we do? So we set out a set of product goals. We said, most importantly, it's got to be supportable. If it's supportable, then it will emit lots of useful information. It'll be sensibly organized. We'll be able to reason about what happened. And naturally, it'll be easy to explain and understand. It had to be effective, both in terms of accelerating the build of new payment solutions, as well as growing out the functional capabilities. Essentially, it had to support that low TCO message. Bulletproof was a phrase that we settled on to express the resiliency required from the product. It had to provide the guarantees and the guardrails and be consistent and reliable in the face of problems. It had to handle surging workloads without buckling. It had to be extensible. It had to be extensible so we could grow out functional capabilities as well as catering for the unique factors that we saw at our clients. Embracing modularity and strong contracts was something that we saw would help us, and separating the technical factors from the domain factors was also very important. And the final point was best practice. So by applying the best practices and the best techniques and approaches, it would address that relatable question and challenge, and then we'd be able to make it resonate and understand with different audiences. We'd be able to confidently answer the why question when challenged on some of our decisions and choices. So, breaking it down, and what are the core challenges that we had to overcome? Firstly, process management. I tried very hard. Originally, that was transaction management, but I tried very hard to avoid those words because transaction management, distributed transaction management, bring in the technical nuances and things we all know and love. So, but ultimately, that's where it gets to. They're the challenges you have to solve. But the point really is that when we receive an instruction, we have to take it on a journey through to some form of conclusion. A typical journey of a credit transfer between two banks, may cover 10 different steps, whereby we do some sort of validation, some control checks. We might enrich the instruction. We'll do some kind of checks to make sure it's not fraudulent or it complies with sanctions. And then we'll do some accounting and we'll do some interbank messaging before we can take it to completion. Some instructions are also like a one-to-many, so starting one transaction can kind of lead to processing many others, and they kind of all have to be completed as a group. And we had to make sure as well that the payment journeys were self-describing in terms of the logic, and we wanted to create a collaborative experience so that our BAs and our experts could sit down with the payments experts with our customers, and they could work on, elaborating out the payment flows. We didn't want the business details to be hidden away. We wanted it to be explicit. but we wanted a tailorable experience. When it gets to the data management, so I don't know, so the payments people in here will be familiar with the joys of a pane one or a pack state. It's a very rich in data, and lots of new information is created as you take that payment on a journey. The state management needs to be consistent and durable, and you need the ability to be able to recover maybe from a replica when things go wrong. Running a payments operation relies on the ability to inquire when a customer phones up and says what happened. So that's also part of the data management. As I mentioned at the start of the talk, payment volumes in large global banks can get well above 100 payments per second. And this leads to a challenge to the data layer in managing lots and lots of inserts and updates and queries. So it's got to be super performant at scale, as well as when it's populated, and meet all of the other abilities. As I mentioned earlier, there's lots and lots of integration in payments, and lots of that is bespoke. Mainly, we see these days Kafka being used as both a broker, request response broker, as well as for kind of pub/sub type communication. Predominantly it's JSON format, but we also see XML and fixed format. So we needed to come up with something that would accelerate integration, be performant, be composable, as well as be explicit in what's happening technically. The final aspect I've mentioned here is flexibility. So this is a little bit different than the other three. It's more of a quality, more of a principle. You can't necessarily go and wire in a flexibility framework through Maven. So this really spanned the thinking that we had to put into the product. So finally, we're here, folks. We're getting to the meat in the sandwich. I'm going to run through the architectural decisions that we made and explain why. So, to address the problem of modeling payment flow and honoring our desire to be domain-driven, we kept coming back to the idea that we need a DSL. We have to encode the payments domain. And one of our principal engineers, Tom, did a little bit of research and then took it upon himself to create a pretty comprehensive prototype using JetBrains NPS. When I first saw it, I knew that this was a winner. I knew that this was the horse to back. And we kind of canned some of the other evaluations that we were doing of generic orchestrators or even our kind of config-driven orchestrator. And now our BAs can genuinely sit down with our clients, their payment SMEs, and quickly build out flows, and then tailoring them to the client-specific journey and their payments language. The tool, we're doing that. See the icon? Yeah, the tool made it very easy to write generators, and we use that to generate documentation, BDD test packs, graphs which represent the flow, as well as the code which will, we wrap and run in production. It demos really well, and it's probably one of our unique USPs. The next choice, really, full orchestration, is really that age-old debate to orchestrate or choreograph. Where we settled was somewhere in the middle, in a sense that we wanted the payment journey to be fully orchestrated. We wanted a flow to manage the boundary of processing, but yet we wanted the event-driven type approach for inputs to drive the next step of processing. Next one. Event-sourced finite state machine. So event sourcing, again, is a really good technique to describe a journey. It's just a set of facts that happen along the way. And a finite state machine is a really good way to reliably do an orchestration. So luckily, we were already using Akka, and Akka announced that they had this thing called an event source behavior. And that really, backed by persistence, that allowed us to use that as the backing for our orchestration services. It's very easy to trace back from the generated code back to the model without much cognitive overload. And obviously, one of the things that Akka provides is Akka Cluster, which gives us that production scaling as well as being lightweight, efficient, and fault tolerant. The next point around reactive microservices. So why just have microservices when you can have reactive microservices? Carving up the payments domain into a different set of microservices seemed like a good way to divide up the problem and draw some boundaries. It was a challenge internally to agree what the names of the microservices, what the boundaries were, but Icon is surrounded by payments experts, and they were part of the conversation. And you'll see a high-level view of how that looks on the next slide. For the reactive side, just let me do this. For the reactive side, we used a library called Alpaca. So Alpaca is really a reactive integration, a reactive streaming library. And we use that to create pipelines for doing our integration. Because it's reactive, you get some cool things for free, such as async, non-blocking back pressure, and that helps regulate things as workload fluctuates. And it solves that mismatch between fast producers and slow consumers. We kind of built a connector framework on top of that, and that's an accelerator that we use when we're doing integration with our customers. CQRS was kind of a natural progression from event sourcing. And really within the payments processing, there are two different sets of characteristics from the processing side and from the query side. So obviously on the using an event source approach, the right side is very insert heavy. And on the read side, we don't need to be to the millisecond consistent. It's okay to be eventually consistent. And we needed to be able to create different views to support inquiry and other use cases. MongoDB, as you can see, kind of was perfectly positioned to handle all of our data concerns, and it scales and gives all of the abilities that you would expect. So we've had great experiences with Mongo, and we continue to use more and more features as they become available. The final point was really cloud native. So we were already, to some degree, cloud native, but we sort of doubled down on that approach and started being more strict about alignment to 12-factor, 15-factor principles, and plus expanded our proofs on the different flavors and services backed by Kubernetes. This wouldn't really have been possible without some guiding hands. So domain-driven design, I've already kind of mentioned quite a lot, but I think there's a quote that goes something like this: "It is the best approach that we've found so far to tackling the complexity in software systems." Now, I don't know if that's entirely word for word, but we wholeheartedly agree with it. Hexagonal architecture, or puts and adapters architecture, onion architecture, clean architecture, explicit architecture. There's lots of different terms here, but we use that thinking to influence how we kind of structure our modules and the dependencies between them. There's an excellent series of posts by a chap called Roberto Grasca, I think, that really distill this area, and I've kind of got a resource at the end if you want to go and look. Event storming, again, was a useful and fun exercise that we did at the beginning. Allowed us to think about what the different domain events were, how to name them, where the kind of bounded contexts were, as well as where some of the hotspots were for like change and challenges. It was still really, really important that we had a great developer experience, both for our own engineering team on the product or the solution side, as well as, in the future, SI partners and even customers themselves that want to take the toolkit and go and get the education, go and build things themselves. Low code is a probably overused term that's bandied around. There's lots of great general purpose tools around, but the other day I joked that actually our approach is really enough code. Yes, that was one of my own animations. Last on this slide, and very importantly, we created a principle. So we created many principles at the beginning and adopted some of the ones out there like solid, etc. But we struggled a little bit with documentation, so we elevated its status. We kind of made it a first-class citizen, and we made it as important as the code. So that kind of instilled good practices in the engineers, and we kind of started to use ASCII doc in the repos to make sure that the documentation was fully up to date. Okay, so from a very high level, this is what it looks like, and this is kind of positions where we are. So on the left side, you'll see that we've got channels, so the workload really arrives from channels, so the bank's customers, as well as from the payment networks from other banks. These instructions come into a set of services, so for the channels, we tend to use initiation services. Sometimes this is called order management, it depends where you are, but that's really kind of working out, is the instruction valid? Does it need any enrichment? Which network does it need to go? Does it need to go now? And then, if it's ready, then it will hand over to an execution service. An execution service is kind of, a typical one would be a credit transfer service. So this would be managing the kind of either the outbound or the inbound orchestration to transfer the funds between banks. Clearing and settlement is obviously part of that execution, but we used it as a way to really adapt to each payment network. So whilst ISO 222 is becoming the standard, there are still some different formats and protocols out there. So we kind of, encapsulated that in a clearing and settlement service, but put a standard API on it so that we could sensibly integrate to it. And then really, obviously, there's lots of core banking control systems we integrate. The ODS is really our kind of read side. It's our operational data store that we use for inquiry. We also have a thing called business functions, which is, again, a way to encapsulate capabilities, functional capabilities, to do things such as like beneficiary name comparison, etc. And obviously, we've got a GUI to support inquiry. So we'll deeper dive now a little bit just on how we made it work. So this is just a view of a typical service. So as mentioned, the domain or the domain service is at the center. That is the generated artifact that comes from the modeling that we do in MPS. That's kind of wrapped, encapsulated by the application layer, the application core, and kind of only knows interfaces. So the application layer is really the glue between the domain and the outside world, a set of frameworks or infrastructure. And then the infrastructure layer is really just so we can use different bindings either to different libraries, different protocols. And again, just so we don't have to keep changing the application code, we can, it's just to separate the concerns. And as you can see, the behaviors operate with commands, events, and the state. So the aggregate here being the state, being the transaction that's in flight. And there is a kind of reliable mechanism that when an input arrives, it's kind of turned into a command. It's sent to the behavior via Akka cluster, which will either create a new one or find one that's there. And then once an event is persisted and we get an acknowledgement back from Mongo, then we can mutate the state and then go and perform the next action. So it's a very reliable way to consistently go from one step to another without any kind of loss of information. And at the bottom, obviously following the CQRS pattern, that change stream is again picked up by something called an event processor. That's something that Akka also provided as an abstraction so that we can hook into that and then go and do things like transform that data and go and create views and feed our ODS. So, what are the results? So far, so good. Pretty good, actually. So it's definitely easier to understand. It's faster demo and POC. So we've had some POCs where there's been a surprise week. We don't know what we're going to get asked to do. And we've managed to kind of exceed expectations. And sometimes we like to think that we're a speedboat with a set of goodies that allows us to outmaneuver, the super tankers, which are kind of our competitors. It's got a great dev experience, so our engineers love to either, expand the core product or go and build solutions on top of it. The engineers are quickly becoming productive, so within a few days, they're picking up their own stories. They're kind of, maybe pairing on stuff initially, but they're picking up their own stories, and they're able to deliver value quite quickly. Because we've put the effort into thinking about the boundaries and the design and the modularity, that makes it easy to extend and easy to extend the products and also easy to extend in customer situations as well. And the most important point is obviously this is leading to real actual sales, a strong and healthy pipeline, and a busy set of sales and pre-sales team. So, final slide, and then if there's any time left, we'll do a Q&A. So, final point, so listen to your gut. So, as I mentioned, this conversation that started in the pub led for an interesting journey for me, but I just couldn't professionally live with something that was suboptimal. So, I think you've always got to challenge the status quo. You've got to kind of break through the norms and try and get stakeholders on board, if you've got an idea. Engage experts, whether that's internal or external, kind of, I guess the power of the team is the most important. But you've also got to obsess on your problem, because when you start to obsess on it, then things that you see and do and hear in conversations kind of spark ideas, and you sort of, everything starts relating back to the problem. So you do have to have a certain amount of obsession on your problem. Experiment and learn as a team. We did maybe 4 prototypes that took quite a few weeks, and we threw them away. But we did that consciously. We did that as a team, and kind of we broke down the barriers. Everyone had different roles, but we really were a homogeneous team that was just kind of on this journey to go and create the best payment framework that we could. As we know, there's no silver bullet, but there are lots of good techniques and approaches and patterns out there, and what we found is some things complement each other, and then you get that aggregated strength as it all comes together. Contact with customers can lead to interesting things that you didn't see, but you kind of need to get out of the building. You need to go and speak to customers, and you need to kind of get that feedback, and that will help you evolve your product. Second to last point, build strong partnerships like MongoDB. So Mongo has been a great supporter of us since kind of Boris reached out and got in touch maybe 3 years ago. So we have had a great working partnership. We've done countless things together, and that goes from strength to strength. But their support and their kind of energy and passion has really, really helped us evolve. And finally, if you're crazy enough to think about building yet another payments engine, just don't do it. It's not worth it. I didn't used to have any grey hairs, but yeah, certainly get in touch, call us, and yeah, I think that's it.